Alright, so a disclaimer before we start. I don't actually sound like this in real life, and I'm not very good at reading. I am really trying my hardest to read this properly because my brain isn't like connected to my mouth. It's not like a medical condition, it's just I can't read. I can't read. I can read in my head, I'm a really quick reader, but I just can't read out loud, so if I mispronounce some stuff, that's probably why. Just ignore it. Phil has the same problem, so I'm not alone. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed this chapter, and until next time, this is Whisker out. Cheerio. Dan rubbed his head. He was currently sat in the middle of an empty road, propped up on one shoulder, feeling very confused indeed. Ugh, he groaned. What happened? He still has his eyes squeezed shut from falling onto the tarmac, and the sun was so bright that he couldn't open his eyes anyway. I don't know. The voice of Phil Lester came from beside him, sounding equally as bewildered. Where even are we? Dan turned his head to him and flickered his eyes open, shielding himself from the glaring sun to the left of him with his hand. Phil stared back at him, looking very slightly scared. The only thing that Dan could see ahead of him, behind Phil, was a long tarmac road, some nice aesthetically pleasing trees, and a familiar-looking lake. Phil, why do I recognise this place? He stuttered. He was trying to think back to what he was doing right before he found himself in this strange place, but he couldn't quite remember. He was at home, in the office, and that's all he could recall. He turned around when a tap on his shoulder alerted him. It was, of course, Phil attempting to get his attention. What's wrong? Dan asked, which was a stupid question because they had somehow been teleported into the middle of a road in the place they didn't know, and things couldn't really be more wrong. Phil was staring upwards with a shaky finger pointing to whatever was in front of him, following his line of vision. Turning to the side, Dan slowly looked up to see what was bothering his friend so much, and, to his absolute shock, saw something that he thought he would never see. Is that... he choked in surprise. Is that Dell's house? Phil didn't reply. He was too in amazement to even speak. He looked as if he was about to pass out, and his usually pallid skin was even paler than usual. But there, right in front of them, was the house of their Sims in all its glory, complete with llama hedge, towering owl slide, lawn flamingo, and unplanted roses lining the path. Phil, this is impossible, Dan breathed. This doesn't just happen. Phil? Are you okay, Phil? Dan, Phil stammered. Come on, Phil, spit it out. Phil didn't go on. He still looked faint and he was shaking like a leaf. Dan looked around, and behind him he saw the familiar surroundings of Willow Creek, their Sims' neighbourhood. It was all there. The river where they met Tabitha, the Pancakes house, and, of course, Dell's eccentric house. Suddenly, before Dan could say anything more to encourage his friend to express some sort of opinion, there came a deep American voice from behind. Bob Pancakes stood outside his front door, holding a mug of coffee and looking very tired. Good morning, fellows, he called across to Dan and Phil. You all right there? Looking a bit lost, I see. No, we're fine, Dan replied, laughing awkwardly. Just admiring the scenery. Which wasn't quite a lie. Bob didn't seem convinced, but after picking up the daily newspaper, he went back inside anyway. Dan, Phil breathed eventually. It had taken him a full 3 minutes to calm down, and even now his breath was staggered. What's going on? I don't know, Phil, Dan replied calmly, putting a delicate hand on his shoulder. But don't worry, we can figure something out, I'm sure. Phil didn't seem to hear him. Maybe he did, but Dan couldn't tell because he still had his eyes glued to the house in front of them. Crying was what Dan heard next. A baby's crying. It was coming from the house, so obviously it was Dylan Tabitha's badly named son. Dab? Dan murmured. Phil, we have to move before anybody sees us. We're really near the living room window. And he stood up, his legs wobbly. Need a hand? He got no response from his friend, so grabbed him by the arm and yanked him to his feet before pulling him behind the llama hedge. What do we do? Phil half whispered and half hissed, his eyes wide and his skin even sallower than normal. For the last time, I have no idea, Dan replied in a hushed voice, so just calm down and take the day as it comes, okay? From behind the hedge, Dan could see through the window and into the living room. He could see all the familiar items in that room that he recognised from playing the game. The dining table with the momentum conserver atop it, the glass door to the tiny swimming pool outside, and Jonathan the minnow swimming around gaily in his glass tank on the coffee table. Dab's crying eased, and now Dan could hear footsteps walking into the lounge. Dill and Tabitha. "Quiet!" Dan hissed to Phil, peering into the house to see Tabitha emerge from the baby room carrying the child in her arms. She was saying goodbye, it seemed, to Dill as she headed out to work. Dan pulled his friend down to the grass and clapped a hand over his mouth as their sim left the house through the front door, still carrying her baby, and walked past the lawn flamingo and down the road. "That was close," Dan breathed when Tabitha was out of earshot. "You all right there, Phil? Looking a bit faint?" Phil Lester was not, in fact, all right there. In fact, it looked as if he was going to have a panic attack. It was the first time he'd seen one of his sims in the flesh, and he wasn't taking it too well. How is this supposed to happen?" he stammered, desperately, frantically, wringing his hands out like they were on fire. "This is impossible. This can't actually really be happening. We can't, and we don't, Phil, you're not making any sense. We have to do something. Anything, Dan." Dan held onto his arm to restrain him. "What do we do? But this..." Phil started again, but Dan cut him off. "Phil, you need to calm down," he snapped. "You're only making this harder for yourself." "But Dan, No, shush, just breathe, alright? In, out, in." Phil was about to retort with another distressed and worried altercation, but right then he noticed somebody walking down the street, heading their direction, and he hurriedly composed himself so as not to look like a lunatic who had just escaped from a psychiatric hospital. The someone walking towards them was, in fact, Jade Hope, an old friend of Dill's who had very red high heels and a very well-kept afro. Fortunately, she did not notice that Phil was sweating like he'd just left a sauna and that Dan looked like he was attempting to detach his arm. "Look, Phil," Dan hissed under his breath when Jade had passed. "There's literally nothing we can do until we know what got us here. Now, do you remember anything that we were doing 10 minutes ago?" Phil stared at him with his round, not quite blue but not quite green eyes and slowly tilted his head to the side. "Funnily enough," he replied, shakily, "no, I don't." "Neither do I," Dan said, letting go of his arm. "I suppose we got temporary memory loss from the fall, so until we remember what we were doing right before we ended up here, we can't do anything to escape." No. But, however, seeing as we're here, no, don't look at me like that, Phil. I see this as an opportunity." "An opportunity to what?" "To introduce ourselves to our sims, of course. Now come on, what are we waiting for?"